Welcome again to PL Presents, and hope you've all been keeping well out there. Now, with 2020 speaking for itself and further lockdown restrictions ahead, the TV will be more essential than ever for a lot of people, with classic comedies often the perfect pick-me-up. Well, on that note, I'm pleased to be joined today by one of the TV stars from my childhood, and a man you may just recognise from Maplin's Holiday Camp, Lord Meldrum's House and Hatley Railway Station. Jeffrey Holland, great to see you.
Hello there, Patrick. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and yourself. Well, starting off then, Jeffrey, as a boy growing up in Walsall in the post-war years, what inspired you to take to the stage?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try and keep it short. When I was about 15 years old, my friend Peter and I were going to a rather boring youth club every weekend. And he came to me one weekend and said, look, I found this amateur drama group for under 21s, which of course we were. And he said, well, did you come along with me next week and we have a see what you think? I said, what do you mean amateur drama group? What does that mean? So he said, well, they do, do play readings, they rehearse and they put shows on. I said, what do you mean, act? Act? Me? I was as big as I am now. I was 15, huge Buddy Holly type bottle-end glasses, covered in spots, big teeth, no self-confidence whatsoever. And the last thing on God's earth I thought I would ever do was stand up in front of people and be silly. Well, then he said to me, the girls are very pretty. I said, what time do you want me? And that was the start. I went with him to this amateur drama group and found at the end I found I had a sort of comedy, a talent for comedy. And I heard laughter and I liked it. I thought we have some more of this. So I stayed in the amateur world for a few years. And then at the age of 19, I went on to drama school in Birmingham and trained for 3 years to be professional. And the rest is history, as they say.
So having then turned professional then, I'm guessing sort of around about the late 60s, you went on to appear in some episodes of some real big hitters like Dad's Army, Are You Being Served, It Ain't Half Hot Mum. But it was this time, 40 years ago, in fact, I believe this year, when the legendary co-writers of David Croft and Jerry Perry made you a household name in the UK as a holiday camp comic of Spike Dixon in Hi-de-Hi. How life-changing was it to land that role?
Well, quite fundamentally life-changing for me, really, because I'd worked with them both on the stage show of Dad's Army back in '75. That's how I met them in the first place. I'd done a lot of character work for them in that show and then played Walker on tour on stage with Arthur Lowe and all the team. And as a result of that show and doing various different things in that show for them, they found me quite useful. I did a couple of Are You Being Served for David as a customer. And then a couple of 8 Half Hot Mums and an episode of final series of Dad's Army too, which was on the other week actually, just repeated recently. And then when Hi-de-Hi came along, they wrote Hi-de-Hi. They're going to shoot the pilot in '79. They wrote Spike with me in mind.
All right.
Gratified because I've worked with them quite a bit before that, and they knew what I could do, and they wanted me to play this hapless comic with no talent whatsoever. There I was. Yeah, it was good. Great.
Well, with Hi-de-Hi then being set in a holiday camp in late 50s Britain and many stunts with, as you say, poor old Spike often getting lobbed in the outdoor pool. And I mean, the camaraderie you must have had on set with many contrasting characters as well. It must have been amazing.
It was fantastic. I mean, that was Jimmy and David's great knack, was casting a group of people together that props wouldn't normally mix together, and they got the right actors for the right characters and put us all together, and it was one big happy family. We had a fantastic time, really. It was almost a shame to take the money, but we were just enjoying ourselves so much. But that's what happened with the characters in Hi-de-Hi, with the entertainment staff. They were all failures in their own chosen professions. That's why they had to come this summer season. It was the only work they ever got. And like the men in Wilmington-on-Sea, or the businessmen in Wilmington-on-Sea, they would never have socialised together. But under the common umbrella of the Home Guard, you see, they were forced to get together. And that's where the comedy comes from, in their clashing relationships.
Yeah, and obviously that was a real testimony to Croft and Perry. And I think as well as everyone knows that they're incredibly talented writers, but I think for me very strategic as well, because with Hi-de-Hi being aired in the 80s, I think there's some argument for saying it was the one sitcom, probably more than any other, where three generations at that particular time could all relate to, because obviously people of like my grandparents' age, well, the 1950s was a time to smile again after the Second World War, and obviously my parents' age, well, the 50s was their childhood, and I suppose, if you like, a simpler time. And for me as a kid growing up in the 80s, UK holidays were still very much the norm, so the Maplins template was kind of something we could relate to as well. So I'd say at the same time, all three generations could enjoy that.
That's right. That's why it did appeal right across the board to the whole family, because the older generation remembered, the post-war queuing up for everything. Everybody queued, so they were quite happy to queue for a second session of dinner in the dining hall. And the younger people remember going, like myself. I went to a couple of Butlins holiday camps as a small boy with my parents for a holiday. And I knew it very well, knew the situation very well. And of course, with the youngsters, such as yourself at the time, maybe, it appealed because of the characters and the colour in it, and all the wonderful silly characters and the relationships that went on between them. So it did appeal right across the board. It's still as good today, 40 years on. And I'm still getting fan mail from kids who weren't born when it was out in the 80s.
Oh, really?
It's wonderful.
Well, 8 years on then, 8 glorious years then of Heidi High, and the final time you hear Goodnight Campers over in Dovercourt. Croft and Perry then went on to write You Rang Me Lord, a 1920s based sitcom. Although you had the continuity of fellow Heidi High stars Paul Shane and Sue Pollard having central roles as you did as well, how difficult was it for you to portray the character of the rather uppity footman James Twelvetrees just 2 years on from your very different and long-running role of Spike?
It was very difficult to adjust at first, because Paul and I were working very closely together when we were rehearsing the battlefield scenes for the pilot, which of course it opens in the First World War in the trenches. We were calling each other Spike and Ted instead of Alf and James. It got very complicated at times, but we soon adjusted. Of course, and it was a great joy to work together. That's why Jimmy and David liked us working together, because we were great friends, and we were all three so very different people physically too. So that's what part of the attraction, I suppose. And
then, just for good measure, the three of you went on to appear in Dr. Beeching as well a couple of years later.
A little bit of a gap before Beeching came along. It was brought to Jimmy and David by Richard Spendlove, who's an experienced broadcaster in his own right. But he'd also been, in his youth, at 23 years old, he'd been the youngest station master on British Railways. And he thought there were some marvellous stories to be told of that period, of the Beeching years, in the early 60s. So he brought the idea to Jimmy and David. Jimmy sadly didn't want to know, because Jimmy only liked to write about what he knew about, and what they'd been writing about before was stuff they all knew about because they'd been there. But he didn't know anything about the railways, steam railways. He didn't particularly like the steam railways, so he bowed out and just pulled out and left David to get on with it on his own with Richard Spendlove. And Richard, of course, was very helpful in contributing to the storylines and the ideas and what actually happened in his own experience. So those characters, again, based on people that really existed. And David pulled in a few friends to help him write the scripts, and we did a couple of series of that before it was axed, sadly, in the mid to late 90s. You see, the comedy was changing then. A lot of the stand-up that's out there now was coming along, and the sitcom was changing, and the BBC was going through some changes. They were doing things like Men Behaving Badly, which was a brilliant, very funny show, and brilliantly played by the cast in there. And but that's how it was moving. It was moving into more adult humour,
yes.
and references and swear words and stuff like that. Whether you approve or not remains to be seen, but that's the way it was going. It's still much loved because it's still out there and still being. The DVDs are selling well, so so it says a lot for the comedies come full circle, really.
If you got a modern writer and they looked at all those sitcoms and they were tempted to write one because they were inspired by it, and they picked a period maybe from the past 30 years, do you think that's something that would work in this day and age?
I think it probably would if the writers were good enough. That's what's at the basis of all good comedy is good writing. and that's what Jimmy and David were so good at. But if the writing is up to, the writer's up to it, then I'd say by all means, let's have a series from the swinging 60s, why not? I'd welcome it. If there was a part for me in it, I'd welcome it even more.
Having appeared in many other roles as well over the years, I believe it was 2013 that you co-wrote and starred in the one-man play And This Is My Friend Mr. Laurel. I saw on your website that Stan Laurel was a character that you idolised a lot as a boy. Was this therefore the most satisfying role that you've performed?
I think so. It's worrying, but the cherry on my particular personal cake, that one, is something I've wanted to do, and I had to wait 40 years before I could do it because I was not the right age. You see, I got the idea back in the 70s about doing a one-man show about Stan Laurel, but of course I was only in my 20s, and you can't do you tell a lifetime story until you've had a life. So I literally waited over 40 years to get that together. Then I met Gail Lowe, who wrote it for me, or with me rather, because she wrote the bulk of the text. She's a very talented playwright, and I put the comedy in, did all the rest of it, and we had 3 sellout seasons in Edinburgh with it. And if, please God, 2021 happens and the festival comes around, I'll take it back there again, in August next year. That's the plan, because next year, 21, would be 100 years since Laurel and Hardy first worked together, made their first film together in 1921. So that would be something to celebrate, I think.
Is the touring of Stan Laurel going to be in the UK, or I suppose all depending on what happens with the restrictions, but was the plan to sort of go to other countries as well? I
was in Dubai with it, actually, last year. We did a gig in Dubai with it. But no, it can go anywhere. I mean, I'd love to take it to America. But I've been taking it around the UK since I started with it, all over I've had to cancel all kinds of bookings this year with it, because, this year, I'm just looking at this year, 2020, really as my gap year. It's just, there's nothing happening, no theatre, there's no work for any of us. So we'll just sit back and enjoy it, really. But I'm hoping for the best for next year, providing this second peak doesn't go too far, for too long. Fingers crossed.
No, absolutely, yes. Well, Jeffrey, it's been absolutely fantastic meeting you here and hearing all about your long and illustrious career. And, obviously we'll keep an eye out for all those shows you've got coming up in 2021, all being well. Well, that's it for today, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us. And for myself and special guest, Jeffrey Holland, a very good day to you all.